So we've had for chapters 1 and 2 done. How do you think so far? So in chapter 2, Ben got the letter back from Cara saying that she wasn't going to come back from the island, which left a few things in doubt for Ben. And at the end of the chapter, after a little bit of realization, he's decided that he's going to go to the island. So let's pick it up from chapter 3 and see what happens next. Cara and I had never been what you might call a perfect couple. If we were shuffled into a crowd of people being paired off by some great cupid, we might not automatically be selected for each other. To put it at its crudest, the sorting mechanism might pick someone more creative for me and someone more ambitious for her. I always found it reassuring that we didn't have the neatness of shared interests. It proved to me that what we actually loved about each other was each other, rather than pale reflections of ourselves we saw in each other's eyes. We met in Florence. I'd been there about 8 months by then, studying with Anthony, drawing to an end my first year. She'd only been there for 2 weeks. She was visiting with her guardian, her aunt, like something out of E.M. Forster. But there she was, taking a break between years of university. I was in one of the little cafes overlooking the Duomo. I'd worked out I could supplement my tiny income by listening in the cafes for the sound of a native language and introducing myself to the people who spoke it. I would slowly turn the conversation to the city's artistic heritage, the glories of the Uffizi. Then they asked what I did. I would reveal I was a training at Anthony's studio. In the early days, I neglected to mention that studying under Anthony, I was not even allowed to paint yet, that we had to spend a year working in charcoal first until our eyes reached new heights of accuracy. Nor did I mention this extracurricular work to Anthony, although he did understand I had to stay alive while I learned. More often than not, the marks suggested that I paint them, but not. I carefully introduced the idea. When they asked my rate, I would demur before naming a figure roughly double what I would have been happy with. Once they had made a counteroffer, it was really only a matter of haggling. I had rented a tiny studio, an upright coffin with a skylight at the top, and lime-washed walls, and took them there for settings. I marvelled in the later years of how confident I must have been to spend my days trying to this trick. It amused the cafe waiters when it didn't work, but it got me a lot of unofficial commissions. All doubtless painted before Anthony would have said I was anywhere near ready. That was my whole life, really, before Cara. There had been women, sometimes but very few, and in any case I thought of love as a frivolity. The work didn't allow it. One day I approached a girl about my age, the companion of an older woman. The girl was good looking, although there was something about her I recall finding too smart, too scrubbed with propriety. I was wrong, of course. Her eyes were hazel, her skin light brown. When her aunt had left the table, the girl asked me bluntly what I wanted, and I told her in a moment. That surprised her, and surprised me. I didn't usually share the game with anyone whilst I was still playing it. She told me I could pay for the drinks, and I understood the game she was playing with me. I've tried to deceive her, so I had to make a sacrifice to balance the account. I didn't mind. I asked her name, and for some means of contacting her, and she wrote the name of the hotel she was staying in, Diodati, on a napkin with her name beneath, Cara Sharp, and so it began. I never painted her during her time in Florence. An Inuit superstition of mine told me that I had painted a person completely. I would have no further need of them in my life, nor they of me in theirs. So I did not paint her, rather, neither then nor later. The only depiction of her I ever made was a small pencil sketch, the morning after our first night together. I did not break my arbitrary self-imposed rule, but anyway, for the first time in life, I felt as if, in drawing her, I was depicting a newly discovered part of myself. I woke in bed and realised I must have transferred myself there from the sofa in the night. For a pleasant moment, I was empty, remembering nothing except the feeling of being home, and enjoying the sight of light settling around the curtains. Then I saw Cara's letter on the bedside table, and the evening before returned to me. It wasn't surprising that she had chosen to do it by letter, of course. We had both grown up as the old networks were breaking down, failing a little further day by day. Even if I'd been able to afford one of the rare devices to receive messages through the either, she might not have been able to send one. Pemberley's island was almost completely disconnected from the world. She told me that in an earlier letter, another of her new employer's wonderful eccentricities. She still could have called more from her posting. We had phone attached to the wall, after all, and the fact that she had rung just once in 6 months was bad enough. My principal memory of that morning was the case with which I had acted on the previous night's decision. I emptied my bag and packed a week's clean clothes, 2 empty sketching books and pencils. I prepared some food too, in case I had to sleep out. The country was more unreliable than usual lately, and I knew I might have to throw myself on some uncertain rural places at night. Taking extra food was sensible, even if it made you a target to anyone who knew you had it. As these preparations occupied me, I was aware of another current of it running through my brain. Studied like a hangover. Cara did not want to see me. That much was clear from the letter, wasn't it? She had the choice over whether she would stay on the island working for her potentate or to me. The fact she had declared on the former, of course, should deter me from going. I dismissed the notion. Perhaps her letters were being observed. Perhaps she had been not able to say how unhappy she felt. I read it again, and sensed she really would like to see me, although duty came first. Well, I would solve that problem. On and on doubts came, and just as quickly I dismissed them. I kept them from my mind. My glaring omission from the letter, the fact that Cara had provided no information at all about when she might eventually return. The only thought I had was about Pemberley. This was his fault, I knew. At some level, he was the author of this change in her and of my misfortune. In under an hour, I had 2 bags ready, the first containing my clothes, food, a book or two, a compartment for cash. The other was my painter's roll, stuffed with as many brushes and implements as I could fit. It seemed silly to take it, but it would have crippled me to leave it, so it came. In the front pocket of my main bag, I packed all Cara's letters. I wanted to take them with me, as if they might act as a passport to get me into the island. After some hesitation, I carefully flattened and packed my pencil drawing of her too. I had the feeling of carrying a household god. My journey was going to be easier than anticipated. The bywaters had inadvertently let me travel across the country as I wished, with the lazy indulgence of wealth. They had bought me a monthly permit, rather than merely a week's travel between their village and my city. I was suddenly grateful to them for their carefulness. The most important thing was to know my destination. This was difficult, perhaps the most difficult thing, as I already knew the place she was living was not listed on maps. Cara had told me that before her departure, and set me the challenge of finding it. She knew I wanted to write to her, and told me that if I was succeeding in locating the island, I'd be able to do so direct. If not, I could address my letters to the firm's head office in the centre of the country, and they would forward them on. I wanted to contact her directly, disliked the idea of even our casual communication being interpreted by Pemberley's staff, so I found it. It was off the west coast, up in the high north of the country. There was a range of inhabited islands there. Pemberley was further up the coast from them, and further out. The closest point on the mainland was a village called Freeborn. I found all this information in an article from 20 years ago, which took a great deal of tracking down. When you searched for the island in the old atlas, its location was plain. These days, when you look for it on a newly bought map, there was nothing. If you looked very closely, there was a faintest wrinkle of ocean around its former edge, as if something had been scrubbed away, and the ghost of a letter S where the name had been. Its name was Sanctuary Rock. I asked Cara about this, and she laughed, and told me perhaps she was moving to Atlantis. When I persevered, asking what kind of person wiped the home address off the face of the earth, she became irritated, telling me I didn't understand Pemberley's business, and there were dozens of reasons he might be concerned about security. Such as being a billionaire, I remember saying I was hoping that the use of the ugly word might rattle her, but in her line of work, billionaire was merely something to aspire to and carried no negative connotations. She simply looked back, imperious, and said yes, such as being a billionaire. And at that point, I could not help laughing and forgiving her because of her hauteur and the ways she was different to me. And the argument was solved, as the thunderstorm solves a humid day. My 2 bags were by the front door of the flat by now. I parcelled up last night's ingredients and left them for our neighbour downstairs. Before leaving, I took one last look behind me. The lights and the 2-ring cooker were off, the windows bolted, the curtains drawn against the sun. If I had known what was to happen, would I have stayed longer, going through my few possessions, thinking of the time we'd spent there together? I'm not sure I would. I wanted to be gone. The city was too hot and the country was still flooded. The news reports could have been an exact repeat of last year's. Men and women wearing waist-high rubber and wading through the streets, towing frightened grandmothers in dinghies, a dog at the prow of one boat and an aerial shot of children on a roof. Then a few days later, the next video package, the return to assess the damage, the maroon tide marks halfway up newlyweds' walls, the ruined furniture, elderly homeowners who had hacked the strength to salvage. None of Hembley's several hundred villages had been flooded, of course. He had arranged their locations cleverly. They were simply anchored higher, so when trouble came or rivers burst their banks, they would be the last to know about it. I made no stops to bid anyone farewell as I left. There were no friends close enough to miss me, not for the few days I thought I would be gone. As for family, my parents were no longer alive, had not been for a decade. They had died separately in place. They left each other when I was 10, but together in time within 6 months of each other. There was no link between their deaths. One illness, one accident, but it made me think of them as a unit even after their deaths, as though their years of separation had been just a quirk of the living. My father was not a large part of my life. Once his marriage to my mother ended, although with hindsight I'm not sure how closely involved he was before that. He and my mother were so different that it seemed miraculous that they had ever come together in the first place. My parents had had me young, very young, in my mother's case. From her comments, it was very clear she thought of the father as a bad influence on me, and she ignored the fact that half of me was him. I never knew how actually made his money, but it certainly wasn't through anything as tiresome as a job. He would not hurt anyone, but the mere fact of criminality would not have put him off any work in itself. Minor fraud seemed to be his speciality. He was the one who died in the accident. The coroner noted that for all occupants of the car he'd been in, drink had been taken, and that was my father. My mother, Jennifer, had wanted the best for me, and after my father left, she set about making sure I got it. Her faith in my abilities was total. I was educated in one of the country's best schools thanks to her. Her brother, my uncle, had paid. He was a wealthy man, rich from oil, and he supported my mother's attitude to elite schooling as a way of out of common lives. From the age of 11 until 18, I spent 9 months of each year at Hillcrest, a school across the border in the north of our country. In the end, I disappointed her. To my mother, my declaration of a career in portraiture was a waste of the schooling she had worked so hard to secure, the sort of thing my father would have done. Conversely, my father was delighted by the choice. It was quixotic, archaic, the perfect job for someone who wanted to know 1,000 people but none of them too well. If it didn't require discipline, he might have taken it up himself. The most illustrative difference between the two of them was in their attitude to Pemberley villages. My mother thought they were wonderful, and even thought, though my uncle could have bought her a place in one, some instinct within her, some innate modesty, kept her from asking. My father never set foot in the village, unless he could earn some money there by doing so, and insisted they were mausoleums for the living, but he always was out of step with the national mood. Despite the fact that we didn't live in the village, we visited. I must have been about 9. Uncle Julian himself. I loved the synchronicity of their names, Jennifer and Julian, was travelling or indisposed. I forgot now, and we never actually saw him, but we did stay in his house. The village was on a hill, and my first impression was the glorious sight of it as it revealed to us through slowly lifting cloud, as if God the magician had whipped the tablecloth away just at the right moment. I remember a few other things: cakes with our names on iced, ramparted walls, the beautiful parks. I must have been too young to notice the queues of workers outside, the service quarters, and so on. Either way, it prompted a sense of avarice in that took years to unstitch. The next time I saw my father after this visit, he asked me about it. I answered in rhapsody, telling him about the ice creams, the entertainments, the lush wide lawns you could play on all day if you chose. I remember he gave me a long, cool glance and said, "Well, you're definitely your mother's son." I had no idea what he meant, and a confidential smile crept over his face as soon as he finished speaking, but his reaction gave me a little shard of unease. Perhaps that was the good. That was the seed from which my later dislike of the villagers grew. I never asked my mother why she and my father had no other children. She was young when she had me, after all, and he not much older than her. I assumed later that their relationship had declined so soon after my birth that she thought of an extra child to tie them together was anathema to them, but was only a guess. There was little time for me to ask with an adult mind. When my mother's illness struck, soon after my 19th birthday, its progress was so sudden, a matter of weeks. There was hardly time for even my uncle's wealth to palliate it. We failed to trace my father, and Jennifer herself seemed quite at peace with that in her last days. His own death in a traffic collision a few months afterwards closed me off from the early life quite conclusively. It was as if the world had provided a definitive answer to any questions I might have still had about myself, an enormous no whenever I look back over my shoulder, propelling me away from it into the future. So things are bubbling up. Ben's on his way to the island. Let's see what happens in chapter 4.